It was inevitable we would get around to talking about Cronenberg, I think.
Well, I've been a big Cronenberg fan for quite a while. On my shelf somewhere around me, I've even got his novel Consumed. His first novel, his debut novel, no, I'm not saying... I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I liked it. It was kind of like when I recently read John Waters' novel. It was good. It was good. Liarmouth, it was called. Their forte maybe isn't literature. Maybe David Cronenberg, it fits a little better. I don't know. We're here about movies, though.
Well, we have said about this how writing a novel and writing like a screenplay is totally different, because the screenplay, it's all in the dialogue, but in the novel it's like all in the description. So does it feel like Cronenberg? Does it feel like a project he maybe would have adapted for the big screen himself?
Well, this is actually quite interesting because David Cronenberg is, of course, quite a cerebral filmmaker, and I think this comes because both of his parents were artists. His mother was a musician, his father was a writer, and I think that writing influence was probably his biggest influence, because there was a period in time where I recall an interview, and David Cronenberg said, he explicitly stated, "I could not care if there was no more movies ever again. I could not care if I ever seen another movie. I just need books." And I think that's probably what he was advertised and consumed, so it makes sense. But I can see that his films are quite literature based. I'd say they're cerebral, they're theme heavy, and that lends itself well to the novelistic approach.
And he's actually known by a few nicknames, one of which is the Baron of Blood, which I do like. That almost sounds like it would have been reserved for someone like Christopher Lee or Vincent Price, someone who came up in the Hammer horror days. Another nickname, I like this, it's the King of Venereal Horror. Has a very kind of slimy, almost kind of off-putting tone to it.
Do you want to be referenced as that? The king of venereal horror? You could get a bad reputation there, Wayne.
It's a nickname that I think these two nicknames, especially the Baron of Blood, he's very much earned because of the kind of material he works with, because he's an early proponent of, we call the body horror genre. I don't know necessarily if he started it. I think he was one of the people who got it off the ground. You know, people say Halloween's not necessarily the first slasher, or Friday the 13th. They just helped popularize a lot of tropes. I think with Cronenberg, starting back in, because he was making movies in, it was like the late 60s, early 70s, wasn't it, when he started directing films?
Well, the one that confused you, his original Crimes of the Future.
It's not a remake, because I always heard that he'd remade Crimes of the Future, because that was one of his first films.
I think he was like, look, my original Crimes of the Future, well, I say original, the original title Crimes of the Future wasn't much of a success. It wasn't a big film. I think it was about an hour long and made for under 20,000. So it was a very small film. But I recently got round to watching his new Crimes of the Future. Now, I was looking forward to it. As I was looking forward to Dario Argento's Dark Glasses, which I actually like. Dark Glasses by Argento. Look, it's not Suspiria, people. It's not Tenebrae, but it's good. And I think with Crimes of the Future, David Cronenberg was probably in many ways riffing on his own catalogue. Many of the same themes, many of the same visuals. It didn't really completely work for me, to be honest. It felt a little flat. It felt a little, we've been here, we've seen that. And in a way, I think that's, the normal progression of time. His mantle, in a sense, has been passed to his son, Brandon Cronenberg. I don't think we're ever going to get another Videodrome, another Dead Ringers, another film of that importance, which, Cronenberg's had his time. He's been a great filmmaker. He's still making relatively important work. It wasn't a terrible film. It was discussing many of his themes, but look, I think it's just a natural progression of things, and in true body horror style, we're on about the degradation of the body, for example. Well, his ideas, in a sense, they're passing on to Brandon Cronenberg, who's picking up the mantle and running with it.
It's funny you mentioned about talking about the body horror. It's the special effects which is something that's really helped make that genre. I was watching an interview with Cronenberg. He was on Letterman. This was in 1992, and Letterman said to him, how do you feel about the special effects in your films? He says, with special effect, it's like trying to get a performance out of a bowl of shrimp salad. It just lies there. He says, I like working with actors. It's more fun. That's something I like about Cronenberg. He's not one of these people who's like in the 90s, when we discovered CGI was a big thing and it could enhance your film, and people really ran with it to the point where these films just became like CGI spectacles. Yep. But for Cronenberg, he keeps it grounded, the fundamentals. He realizes these films are like human stories, and the effects just there to enhance that. The effects are not the basis of the film. They're not necessarily the selling point of them.
I think so as well. That's what I like, especially when you look into early Cronenberg. But There's maybe a point of contention there, because in many ways I'd see Cronenberg as a futurist. I don't think he's one of these directors like a Tarantino or a Christopher Nolan who's got some fond attachment to celluloid, for example. Cronenberg films on digital now. He does include CGI within his new film Crimes of the Future, and I think in a way that feels appropriate for David Cronenberg, because his films are about the future. They usually state in some advanced technology. He seems he's technologically savvy himself. I know he says, for all the faults of Apple, for example, every time they bring out a new product, I get it at the click of a finger. So he is very savvy with modern technology.
And I'll say as well, it's not just body horror as well, because one of my favourite Cronenberg films is A History of Violence, which you could argue is like more of a straight-up thriller. You'd say it's allegorical for the violence in America and whatever. That's a fantastic film. I know you really like that as well, don't you?
Oh, his collaboration, let's say, with Viggo Mortensen, I think they've produced some solid films. History of Violence and Eastern Promises. Obviously, Crimes of the Future, but especially them two films. Eastern Promises is great. A History of Violence is terrific, and that got a bit of kickback from some of his press for that, because he was sick of the whole superhero genre, and somebody stated to him, well, look, A History of Violence is a comic book, because it's an adaptation of a comic book. And he says, yeah, I'm on about superheroes, though. They're just not morally complex.
The Beano and the Dandy are comic books, but they are not superheroes.
Right.
It was a very different approach for him. And Viggo Mortensen himself, I think he said History of Violence, his most favourite films that he's done. It's a great film. It's a very compelling film. It shows Cronenberg's very kind of command of the visual. Eastern Promises was fantastic as well. I didn't see A Dangerous Method, where...
Oh, that was fun.
Yeah, I think Mortensen did not play like Sigmund Freud in that one.
Yeah, we've got Freud and Carl Jung, which is in many ways, it harkens back to this film. That's what I'm saying about Cronenberg, a very cerebral filmmaker. It's all about literature, about psychology, psychiatry, etc., etc. It's all about the mind, the body, how it functions, how we degrade, how we move past things, etc. It's a very interesting filmmaker. And A Dangerous Method, I was on board with that. I really liked that film, and I'd recommend that film.
I will say that one of his possibly most psychological films was also maybe his most controversial, Crash from 1996. Not to be confused with Crash from 2004, because his 96 film was about people who are essentially sexually excited by the concept of car crashes, because is this not territory Tom Six was kind of going over in the Onania Club, people who are sexually stimulated by tragedies and by horrors?
Well, in a sense, and with David Cronenberg, I think it continues one of its themes, which is the fetishization of objects. Mm-hmm. Now, Crash wasn't even the first car film, if we want to call it a car film, he made, because before this film, he made Fast Company, which is a drag racing film. Now, you're probably thinking, what the fuck does David Cronenberg have to do with drag racing? But in fact, in his personal life, David Cronenberg is a huge gearhead. Who would have thought? He likes supercars, he likes Ferraris. I'm sure he made a book on cars or supercars at one point. And, it seems an anomaly. It's not. It's this fetishization of objects, which is part of what Crash is about. And, of course, with Crash, it follows in his interest in J.G. Ballard, which his son, once again, is soon to be adapting a J.G. Ballard book as a series. But look, let's look back to even before this film, Wayne. We had Rabid, we have Shivers, both films exploring, as you said, the king of venereal diseases. And, why would one of them films be controversial? Well, Shivers... This would cause controversy because, that sounds like Sean Connery there, and I don't know why, because it was partly taxpayer funded. Now, in Canada, within 1975 and 1982, they had, quote-unquote, tax shelter films. This is where the federal government allowed investors to deduct 100% of their investment in Canadian feature films from their taxable income. Now, this resulted in a massive increase in the Canadian film business, Shivers among them. And there's even a documentary, if anybody's interested in this period, there's a documentary, and I like this title, called Tax Shelter Terrors. But look, we're talking about Cronenberg. One of his biggest films, his first biggest films, was Scanners, which he refers to himself as his first #1 film. Now, I'm not sure if that went to #1 at the box office or not, but he said it was his first hit, so to speak. But, okay, after Fast Company, he was supposed to be writing a script called The Sensitives. and that would eventually lead itself into Scanners. But before that, he got to The Brood, the film we are discussing today.
One of those films that never gets brought up when you talk about Cronenberg, I guess maybe because, like I said earlier, this was before Scanners, this was before Videodrome, before he'd really hit his groove, so maybe no one really knew what to expect from him. Maybe there really wasn't that many expectations from him to begin with.
Okay, I don't want to bore you. I've got quite a long quote from Cronenberg. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, go ahead.
He said, "The Brood got to the real nightmare, horrific, unbelievable inner life of the situation. This is divorce, his custody battle. I'm not being facetious when I say I think it's more realistic, even more naturalistic than Kramer versus Kramer. I felt that bad. It was that horrible, that damaging." Now, he expanded on this, and this is a bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it's important to the film and the context of the film. He said, "At the time, I was fighting for custody of my daughter Cassandra by my first marriage. I got a call from my ex-wife saying she had decided, for religious reasons, to go and live with these nice people in California," nice is in quotation marks, "and she was going to take Cass with her. I'd get to see her at Christmas and stuff, and she was leaving tomorrow. I said, okay, that's nice, great, good luck. I put the phone down, and I went to the school and kidnapped my daughter." He said, "It wasn't really kidnapping, but we were still sharing custody. I got a court order which prevented her from taking Cass. Then she left. After swearing that she would never leave her daughter, she signed her over to me so that she could go, and that's where she's been ever since."
It does give you this fascinating picture into the mind of this man who'd just been through this horrible event, and he was kind of trying to channel it, but he was channeling it in his own way. He was trying to make a Cronenberg film out of a very personal Cronenberg story.